This video will show you some tips and tricks on how to properly shim your gearbox. I'm only going to go over the shimming process itself, not how to actually disassemble the weapon or the gearbox. There are several other guides out there for that type of thing. Today I'll be working on a version 2 gearbox. Although there are many types of gearboxes out there, the theory and logic behind shimming is pretty much the same for all types. Shims are small circular pieces of metal, usually either stainless steel or copper, that go on the ends of the posts of the gears. Shims vary in thickness so that you can adjust the gaps in between the gears and the gearbox shell, as well as the gaps between the gears themselves. The whole purpose for shimming is to optimize the performance of your gearbox as well as reduce the friction which causes wear and the components of your gearbox to break down. Here are some of the things you're going to need for this project: shims, bearings or bushings, gears, a screwdriver. Some gearboxes have torque screws, and these typically require a T9 tip. I would recommend that you get a set of calipers so that you can verify the width of the shims to ensure that they are 0.2 millimeters or 0.5 millimeters or whatever the specified thickness is. It is a lot easier to shim the gearbox when you remove all the internal components. One component that you will want to remain in the gearbox is the cutoff lever. This sits underneath the sector gear, and if you don't shim the sector gear high enough, then it can the bottom side of the sector gear can actually scrape on this and cause some unwanted friction. So it's best to leave this in so that it helps you judge your spacing. You will want to begin by placing the bearings or bushings in their respective spaces. You can either put them all in at once or just one at a time depending on the gear you're shimming. Either can work depending on the fit of the bushings or bearings, but if they're loose they tend to fall out when you're making sure the gears are in the right position. The first gear you want to start out with is a spur gear. I 99% of the time start out with a 0.2 millimeter shim on the bottom side to give it a good space, and then I guess to the top shim depending on the gearbox as to what the spacing is going to be. I recommend that you always tighten down both gearbox shells completely when you're checking your spacing of your shimming. Some will say all you need to do is firmly hold it together to check your spacing, but I've found that this places an uneven amount of pressure on the gearbox and can tend to pinch where the gears are. This will take a little longer in the end to complete the task, but it's worth doing it right the first time. Next, you are going to check your spacing. The first way to do this is to press on the shaft of the gear from the outside of the gearbox. If you can freely move and wobble the gear, then you know you need more shims. You will then want to add shim by shim until there is no more wobble or movement of this post. This requires pulling the gearbox apart, adding another shim, and then screwing it back down all over again. So it can tend to take quite a bit of time depending on your experience. Now that I've removed all the wiggle in the gear, what I'm going to check for is if it can freely spin. There's a fine line between not being able to move the post anymore and not being able to spin the gear. You want it to be able to spin freely in the gearbox. It's one of the most important things. If it's too tight, it'll jam up. As you can see here, this is me checking the spin of the gear. I'll try and get a good close-up so that you can see how freely it's supposed to spin and not catch or bind or pull on anything. Now that you have your spur gear all squared away, you're going to move on to the next gear, which is the sector gear. The sector gear is a little more complicated. Not only do you have to make sure that there's no wobble in the post and that the gear can freely spin, but you also have to ensure that the bottom teeth of the sector gear line up with as much tooth surface as the top teeth on the spur gear, as well as the sector gear needs to clear the cutoff lever and not rub up against it. Before I close up the gearbox, I'm checking the tooth surface and whether or not the gears are going to grind together and estimate if it's going to rub up on the sector gear or not. After getting my sector gear set, I'm going to go ahead and close up the gearbox. Remember to screw down the gearbox each time to ensure that it's fully tight. Check the post for wobble, and then I will also spin the sector gear to see if it spins freely and without any resistance. You can hear on this clip that as the sector gear is spinning, it's actually rubbing up against the cutoff lever. So I need to add another shim, probably a 0.2 millimeter shim, to the bottom side of the sector gear to help it clear the cutoff lever. Now that my spur and sector gears are shimmed correctly and spin freely, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next gear, the bevel gear. For the bevel gear, you're going to most likely need the same thickness of shim that you put on the spur gear. The main objective here is to line up the bottom teeth of the bevel gear with the bottom row of teeth on the spur gear. Follow the same format as the other gears and completely tighten down the gearbox shell. You will want to check for gear wobble as well as whether or not the gears can freely spin. Provided you have followed these steps correctly and you have no wobble and the gears freely spin, then you have completed your shim job. To recap, the most important thing that you're looking for is that the gears freely spin. Second, you have as minimal amount of gear wobble as possible. And lastly, that you have enough tooth-to-tooth contact between the gears without them actually rubbing together.